A nuclear war could now start with a mistranslated phrase, or a misfired missile no one intended to launch. That's how fragile the balance has become in South Asia, where two rival nations with long-standing hostilities, India and Pakistan, are now closer than ever to the unthinkable. Not over ideology, not over borders, but because of a slow-burning fire no one seems able or willing to extinguish. So here's the question. Is the world quietly sleepwalking into a nuclear crisis that could begin not in Europe, not in the Middle East, but on the subcontinent? Before we dive into the commentary, please like and subscribe to Worldview Today so you won't miss our unique takes on global current affairs. In the early hours of May 10th, Pakistan launched a military campaign ominously named Bunyad-e-Mas, the wall that cannot be broken, in response to escalating border clashes with India. Just hours later, Pakistan's Prime Minister convened an emergency meeting with the country's National Command Authority, the civilian body responsible for overseeing its nuclear arsenal. Let that sink in. This was not just another border skirmish between two historical rivals. This was a signal, calibrated and deliberate, that Pakistan had moved up the escalation ladder, a quiet invocation of its long-standing first-use nuclear doctrine, veiled under the language of national security, but loud enough for the international community to hear. The country's planning minister, Ahsan Iqbal, didn't sugarcoat it. We hate to see the nuclear threshold crossed. The problem? Everyone else hates to admit how close that threshold already is. Because in South Asia, nuclear doctrine is not just theoretical, it's woven into battlefield logic. The United States, aware of the stakes, jumped into damage control mode. Secretary of State Marco Rubio placed an urgent call to Pakistan's top general, Asim Munir. Washington's tone was cautious, but the subtext was clear. Do not miscalculate. Meanwhile, just across the border in India, the stakes were rising in an entirely different way. On May 9th, Indian forces discovered a Chinese-made PL-15E air-to-air missile, nearly intact, in a northern village near the Punjab border. The missile, likely fired from a Pakistani JF-17 jet, failed to detonate. Photos from the site revealed something disturbing. The missile retained most of its structure, including wings, fins, and an exposed guidance system. It was, in effect, a technological gift to Indian defense engineers, a window into Chinese weapons capability. And that's the twist. This isn't just about India and Pakistan anymore. China is deeply embedded as an arms supplier, a political influencer, and increasingly, a security threat by proxy. The PL-15, developed by the China Airborne Missile Academy, is a radar-guided missile with a range of up to 300 kilometers in its domestic version. The export model, PL-15E, is capped at 145 kilometers. But even that is enough to shift the air power balance in the region. For India, recovering an intact missile is an intelligence jackpot. For China, it's an embarrassment. For Pakistan, it's a liability they can't easily explain. And amid this tangled web of geopolitics, the IMF stepped in, not with a peace proposal, but with a check. On May 10th, the International Monetary Fund approved a $1 billion disbursement to Pakistan as part of a broader $1.4 billion climate resilience loan. That's the 24th IMF loan to Pakistan since 1958. India, unsurprisingly, opposed the move. Along with Bhutan, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh, India abstained from the IMF vote, not on humanitarian grounds, but on national security ones. There is a growing belief in New Delhi that IMF funds to Pakistan risk being diverted to military buildup, or worse, to state-sponsored cross-border terrorism. 50 people are already dead from 3 days of intense border fighting involving missiles, artillery, and drones. The region is heating up, not just militarily, but diplomatically, economically, and psychologically. And it's not the only region on edge. Thousands of miles away, China is battling storms of its own, not just externally, but within the very inner circle of power. Xi Jinping arrived in Moscow for high-profile talks with Vladimir Putin. He was accompanied by his chief of staff, Kai Chi, and foreign minister Wang Yi. But one face was conspicuously absent: First Lady Peng Liyuan. Peng, a former military singer with a public persona that once softened Xi's global image, has not been seen in months. Her absence is not just personal, it's political. According to commentator Tai Shun-kun, Xi has always brought Peng on official visits to Russia. But since his recent purges of the top brass, Peng has disappeared from diplomatic events. Tensions between the couple have reportedly escalated. Some claim Xi suspects Peng's past political connections, possibly even blaming her for elevating generals like Miao Hua and He Weidong, who were later purged. Even more explosive is the rumor that Xi no longer holds true control over the military. That power, some claim, has shifted to General Zhang Yuxia, a longtime ally, now rival. And if that's true, then what we're witnessing in China is not just a change of faces, but a shift in the axis of power itself. This instability inside Zhongnanhai, the nerve center of Communist Party control, is happening alongside a disturbing pattern of global outreach, cyber attacks, espionage, and agricultural hoarding. At Stanford University in the United States, an investigative report by the Stanford Review revealed a sweeping intelligence operation allegedly run by the Chinese Communist Party. This isn't classic cloak-and-dagger espionage. It's subtler, messier, and more dangerous. Chinese students receiving scholarships from the China Scholarship Council were reportedly required to file academic reports with Chinese consulates, reports that, in many cases, included sensitive research data in fields like artificial intelligence and robotics. In some cases, agents posing as students allegedly lured female researchers into compromised digital platforms. In others, they were pressured to show political loyalty or face retaliation. Even former research fellows like Song Shen, accused of hiding links to the Chinese military, have become cautionary tales. Though charges against him were dropped, the broader warning remains. Academic freedom in the West may be the new front in a silent war for global technological supremacy. And yet the silence is breaking in some corners of the West. On May 10th, Texas lawmakers passed a bill to ban Chinese nationals, along with citizens from Iran, North Korea, and Russia, from owning property in the state. The bill, SB 17, is being framed as a national security measure, one that echoes rising fears across 27 U.S. states now considering similar legislation. Critics say it's xenophobic, supporters say it's essential. Either way, it reflects a tectonic shift in how America views the civilian front of its geopolitical rivalry with China. And back in China itself, another crisis is emerging. Not in the Politburo, but in the fields. A severe drought in Henan province, which produces nearly 1/3 of the country's wheat, has triggered emergency grain imports. Over 400,000 tons of wheat from Australia and Canada have been purchased in recent weeks. China has also bought up to 1 million tons of barley from France and Ukraine. Despite high domestic stockpiles and a bumper crop in 2024, Beijing appears deeply concerned about 2025 yields. And the reason isn't just climate, it's risk mitigation in an era of strategic decoupling, trade friction with the United States, and volatile global markets. But if food security in China is becoming an obsession, then its counterpart across the Pacific, the United States, is dealing with a different kind of fragility, the diplomatic minefield in its own backyard. In Cuba, American diplomat Benjamin Harmer has become a lightning rod for a government long suspicious of U.S. intentions. Unlike his predecessors, Harmer is not keeping a low profile. He's traversing Havana, openly meeting with dissidents, independent journalists, and human rights activists, and sharing those encounters on social media. The Cuban regime calls him a provocateur. Harmer calls it engagement. In truth, it's something far more strategic. Washington is signaling that it's no longer willing to pretend that normalization means silence. But Cuba, teetering on the edge of economic collapse, with food shortages, blackouts, and vanishing foreign currency, is walking a tightrope. Havana knows that further confrontation could invite new rounds of U.S. sanctions it simply cannot afford. And that is the paradox. The weaker Cuba becomes economically, the more constrained it is politically. Not by its own people, but by the levers of diplomacy and survival. Meanwhile, another state caught in a silent bind is Russia. Except Moscow's silence is strategic, not desperate. The Dutch military intelligence chief, Vice Admiral Peter Bint, recently issued a chilling assessment. Russia is producing more artillery than it needs for Ukraine. Far more. That means one of two things. Either Russia anticipates an expanded conflict, or it's preparing for a long-term posture of war readiness, not just against Ukraine, but potentially against NATO itself. Moscow's military budget for 2024 has doubled since 2015, reaching nearly $19 billion. And satellite intelligence confirms the repositioning of new Russian units along NATO's eastern flank. This isn't just a numbers game, it's a posture shift, an implicit message that the end of the Ukraine war, whenever it comes, will not mean peace. Instead, it may mark the beginning of a new phase, a drawn-out cold peace, where Europe's eastern frontier becomes a zone of permanent mobilization. In the eyes of Dutch intelligence, this is not just about tanks or rockets, it's also about hybrid warfare, cyber attacks on Dutch transportation systems, intrusions into party websites, election interference across the EU. Russia, they argue, is not just attacking borders, it's attacking institutions. And if that sounds familiar, it should. Because China, too, has moved from physical conflict to digital infiltration, using students, hackers, and algorithms instead of missiles. What emerges is a pattern, not isolated events, but a strategy of attrition. Chip away at trust, erode alliances, test the seams of the post-war order until it begins to tear. And in that context, even the IMF's decision to release funds to Pakistan begins to look less like economic aid and more like geopolitical triage. Stabilize the volatile, delay the inevitable. But how long can the global system keep playing this game of fire suppression when the forests are already dry and the sparks are everywhere? The deeper irony here is that the countries making the most noise, Pakistan, India, Russia, China, are not the ones with the most to lose in the short term. They're the ones preparing for a long game. The ones with surplus artillery, cyber doctrines, agricultural contingency plans, and yes, nuclear options on the table. And what about the United States? The world's most powerful nation, still recovering from internal division, facing budget cliffs, and watching its intelligence community come under increasing politicization. Vice Admiral Bint made a subtle but biting remark. When agency heads in the U.S. are looking for new jobs based on political leanings, it's not a good sign for transatlantic security cooperation. What he didn't say, but surely meant, is this. Trust between allies is being tested not by the enemies without, but by the cracks within. And those cracks are growing wider. Which brings us back to the question we started with. Are we sleepwalking toward a nuclear crisis? The answer isn't in a single battlefield. Not in Punjab or Taiwan. Not in the skies above Kiev or the data servers of Palo Alto. It's in the pattern. A rising rhythm of escalation, distraction, paranoia, and opportunism, playing out in multiple theaters, but orchestrated by the same logic. Push boundaries, deny accountability, weaponize ambiguity, repeat. It's happening in how Pakistan signals nuclear readiness, in how India retrieves Chinese tech, in how Xi sidelines his wife and generals, in how Russia builds beyond battlefield need, in how Cuba keeps quiet, in how Stanford tightens its digital gates, and in how Texas draws new property lines with Cold War ink. These aren't disconnected incidents. They're notes in a new geopolitical symphony, one composed not by diplomats, but by algorithms, domestic politics, and strategic misperceptions. So here's the question no one wants to ask. What happens when the music reaches its crescendo, and the conductor no longer hears it? If you value this perspective, consider subscribing to Worldview today and sharing it with someone who still believes in critical thinking. But while the world's attention pivots from headline to headline, from a missile in Punjab to a diplomat in Havana, the larger trend is far more dangerous than any single event. It is the normalization of instability, the quiet acceptance that nuclear posturing is just part of diplomacy, that espionage in universities is simply a side effect of globalization, that authoritarian shakeups are internal matters best left unexamined. This normalization doesn't just erode the guardrails of the international system, it redefines them. And nowhere is that redefinition more dangerous than in the shifting relationship between China and the West. For decades, the West tolerated China's political system in exchange for economic engagement. Trade, not ideology, was the glue that held the fragile détente together. But now, that glue is dissolving. Make no mistake, Beijing knows this. The sudden reactivation of grain imports from Australia, after years of diplomatic frost, was not driven by drought alone. It was strategic diversification, a sign that China is preparing for deeper decoupling from the United States, both economically and politically. This is not just about wheat or barley. It's about hedging against future supply shocks in a world where climate and conflict are no longer separate categories. And yet, China is also walking its own tightrope. Internally, it faces a dual crisis of legitimacy and control. The disappearance of Peng Liyuan from state visits is not just a rumor mill story, it's a symptom. In tightly choreographed regimes like Beijing's, optics are everything. When the First Lady vanishes, something deeper is unraveling. Some reports suggest that her absence is linked to the downfall of senior PLA generals, many of whom were allegedly recommended by her. Others whisper of growing personal estrangement between Xi and Peng, a fracture in the very image of power that Xi has cultivated for over a decade. And what does Xi do when the image falters? He doubles down on projection, on symbolism, on strength. His visit to Moscow was not just about optics. It was a reassertion of China's partnership with Russia, a message to the West that Cold War alignments are no longer relics, but realities. And yet, even that alliance is built on sand. Xi and Putin share mutual enemies, but divergent ambitions. What they lack is trust. Meanwhile, on the ground in Eastern Europe, Russia's military posture continues to evolve, not to end the war in Ukraine, but to outlast it. Dutch intelligence believes Moscow can regenerate its combat capabilities within a year of the war's conclusion. That means even if peace were declared tomorrow, the specter of conflict would remain. Why? Because for Russia, the Ukraine war is not a deviation. It's a proving ground, a place to test doctrine, deploy cyber tools, and expose Western vulnerabilities. NATO knows this. That's why countries like the Netherlands are accelerating military aid to Ukraine and boosting defense spending across the board. Not to win a war, but to prepare for the next phase of what comes after it. And yet, the West remains distracted, fragmented by internal politics, disinformation campaigns, and economic fatigue. The result? A strategic delay in response time. The world reacts when it should anticipate. It patches crises instead of rethinking systems. That's why even stories like Pakistan's IMF bailout, once viewed through the lens of economic recovery, now carry undertones of geopolitical leverage. Is the money truly for flood resilience and debt relief? Or is it a soft containment strategy aimed at preventing Pakistan from spiraling into China's orbit entirely? India's abstention from the IMF vote is telling. So is its quiet campaign to cast doubt on Pakistan's financial transparency and the risk of terror financing. This is no longer just about dollars. It's about narratives, whose story gets told and whose story gets funded. And in Washington, those narratives are becoming harder to control. Intelligence agencies once trusted as neutral guardians of national security are now being pulled into partisan debates. Vice Admiral Bint didn't mince words when he warned about the politicization of U.S. intelligence leadership. When agency heads are forced out not for incompetence, but for ideological reasons, the consequences are not just domestic, they're global. Allies begin to question reliability, rivals begin to exploit weakness, and the architecture of collective security, built painstakingly over decades, starts to wobble under its own contradictions. Because in today's geopolitical environment, power is not just about armies or economies. It's about perception, about who controls the story, the symbols, the signals. And the signals right now are chaotic. A near-nuclear standoff in South Asia, a technological intelligence breach in California, a diplomatic duel in Havana, a military buildup in Moscow, an internal rift in Beijing. Taken separately, these are crises. Taken together, they form a pattern. A slow convergence toward a world no longer governed by rules, but by reactions. And in that world, the old safeguards, treaties, diplomacy, economic interdependence, start to lose their potency. They were designed for a different era, one where war was an event, not a condition. So what happens when conflict becomes the default setting? When the cold peace turns hot in more than one place at once? What happens when the logic of escalation, whether nuclear, economic, or digital, becomes the only logic anyone respects? If you value this perspective, consider subscribing to Worldview today and sharing it with someone who still believes in critical thinking.